Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the over 400 participants joining us today to explore and discuss building a greater resilience for U.S. national security. I'm Mike Sprague. I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Global Risk and Resilience Program and the director of the Polar Institute. I want to thank my colleagues, Lauren Reese and Amanda King, for their hard work to bring this discussion forward. I also want to thank my colleagues from Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, the Risk Cooperative, and the Council on Foreign Relations for informing, influencing, and in fact, shaping the contours of this discussion. Most of us have spent perhaps far too many hours on Zoom, Skype, WebEx, whatever your favorite format is. So our format today is going to be casually professional. So we'll make this more of a discussion than actual presentation. Speaking of discussions, we have 3 discussants, all of which I will introduce in a moment. And the format will be like this. I will discuss with the panelists after our keynote address, the many issues that are raised in our keynote address, but also we'll tease out many themes that we want to first introduce our panelist. Ms. Alice Hill is Senior Fellow for Climate Change Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Alice Priestley served as Special Assistant to President and Senior Director for Resilience on the National Security Council staff. She is co-author of the book, Building a Resilient Tomorrow, Preparing for the Coming Climate Disruption. I recommend this book highly to anyone who is interested in this subject. Dr. Chris Field is the Perry L. McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies at Stanford University. Chris served as co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC, where he led the effort on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation, and Climate Change 2014, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. And Mr. Les Williams, a certified risk manager, co-founder, and chief revenue officer at Risk Cooperative, a very innovative strategy, risk, and advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. Risk Cooperative specializes in creating solutions for emerging risks, such as cyber liability insurance, political risk insurance, and other complex domestic and global challenges. But before we get to the panel of experts, we are grateful to have with us today our keynote speaker, the Honorable Carlos Cabello. He served in the House of Representatives from 2014 to 2019, representing the great state of Florida's 26th congressional. Congressman Cabello served on numerous Education and Workforce Committee, the Small Business Committee, and the very powerful Committee on Ways and Means. And while in Congress, he took the lead on many important issues, including climate change policy, immigration reform, and gun safety. He co-founded and co-chaired the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus and served in a leadership role in the Problem Solvers Caucus. In 2017, he was honored by the John F. Kennedy Library New Frontier Award for his work promoting bipartisan cooperation on environmental policy. And in 2018, he filed the legislation that would invest nearly $1 trillion in American infrastructure while reducing greenhouse gas emissions by pricing carbon. He was ranked the 4th most bipartisan member of the House until returning to the private sector last year. Congressman Cabello, it is an honor to have you with us today, and I turn the virtual floor over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Greetings from Miami, Florida. I'm very grateful to the Wilson Center and to all the other groups and individuals who have been involved in putting together this wonderful event, this opportunity to have a nurturing dialogue to discuss how the issue of climate change and climate risk affects national security, how in the long term it will affect the lives of every single American. And I think importantly, we need to talk about all of this in the context of COVID-19, because although there are certainly differences And perhaps it might be a little soon to start making connections between COVID-19 and other threats to our livelihoods for national security. Certainly, there is a lot to learn. But first, let me tell you why, while I was in Congress, I decided to engage on the issue of climate change and climate risk. I represented the southern tip of Florida, the southernmost district in the United States, and that includes the Florida Keys. And I had a meeting early during my time in Congress in 2015 with NOAA scientists, and they laid out all the data, all the evidence, all the facts, and I couldn't believe that there was not a more serious discussion inside the Congress with regards to rising sea levels, climate change, climate risk, broader environmental policy. So at the time, there were 247 Republicans in the House, the most since the Great Depression. And I started looking for allies, people who would take an interest in this, would help me advance this cause, start talking about solutions. And I discovered that there were only maybe a handful of House Republicans who were interested in talking about this issue, who would put the words climate and change together, much less say them out loud in an audible voice. And that's when we determined that there was a real need for a forum, a place where people in Congress could come together and discuss this issue. And that's how the Climate Solutions Caucus was born. And that caucus grew to have 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats. So we went from a handful of the Republicans who were willing to engage on this issue to 45 who joined together with 45 of their Democratic colleagues to really start a meaningful conversation and eventually to become a significant voting bloc inside the House of Representatives. Why are we in the position that we're today? Because we were caught off guard, because there was no one or not a significant number of people, policymakers, thinking about this issue, thinking about the potential risks. And what's been the cost? Well, obviously, the many lives that have been lost, but perhaps even a greater cause has been the many lives that have been affected. And I'll tell you a human story just to help all of us understand how costly this has been, because we have the television networks and the newspapers reminding us about the deaths every day. And certainly those are important because those are people who have lost their lives, and of course their family members lost them. But I took a trip recently, my first trip since this crisis began in early March. And when we were coming home, it was a Lyft driver that brought us home. And this was a modest man who lives in an apartment that he rents. And he told me that his wife's car had recently been repossessed, and that the car we were in, that he was taking us home in, would be repossessed in the coming weeks, and that he had no choice but to move to Iowa. Now, this is a Cuban American from South Florida. Moving to Iowa is quite the shock. He had no choice but to move to Iowa and work in a slaughterhouse, because that's the only place where he could find work. And his wife was refusing to go with him. So the cost to this man's life has just been immeasurable. And there are countless stories like that all across this country. And why? Well, in large part because we weren't prepared, because we didn't have a working group in the Congress thinking about this and acting on this. COVID-19 teaches us many lessons, very hard lessons, very expensive lessons, very costly lessons, but we should take those lessons. And the next great crisis, if we don't do what we have to do, is certainly climate change. And that means lives lost, jobs lost, homes lost, especially here in places like Florida. Flooding, of course, is the greatest risk we face as a result of the changing climate. And the time to act is not now, it was a long time ago, and we haven't, but we certainly cannot postpone it any longer. So that's why gatherings such as this one are so important, because people are coming together to think together, to exchange ideas, and to figure out how we can prepare, how we can avoid the loss of life and the loss of livelihood that we've seen all around the world over the last few months. The COVID-19 crisis has hurt everyone. No one has escaped it. The same will be true of the growing climate crisis. No one will be able to escape it. Therefore, we have to do everything we can to prepare now. And what does that mean? It means a few critical things. Number one, we need a true and accurate risk assessment. We do not have that in our country. FEMA flood maps are dishonest, incomplete, inaccurate at best, but really dishonest, because a lot of people know the truth about those maps. There are a lot of homes here in South Florida that are excluded from those floodplains for political reasons, not based on data, not based on fact. So we need to come together and say, let's get a real idea of what the problem is. Let's figure out which homes in Florida are exposed to tidal flooding, which buildings, what roads, what government infrastructure, and we have to quantify that. And I'll tell you, the numbers is going to be scary. We've already seen some glimpses of it. The Army Corps of Engineers has estimated that it'll cost about I think it was $500 billion, if I remember correctly, to protect infrastructure in the state of Florida. I think the number is $4.6 billion. Please do fact check me on that. But either way, it's an alarming number, and we need to prepare for that. It's just lying around. And that is, it's $4.6 billion to protect Miami from tidal flooding, storm surge, and other types of flooding. So an accurate assessment. In other parts of the country, it won't be flooding. It'll maybe be the cost to farmers or the cost to protecting reefs from ocean acidification, fishing communities. Climate change will affect all of these. So we need to get a handle on the magnitude of the threat. That's number one. Number two is we need a realistic plan to adapt and to mitigate. Think about COVID-19. We can't only focus on eradicating the virus, getting rid of it. A large part of it is understanding that the virus will be with us for some time, and understanding how we can adapt to that new reality. The same thing is true of climate change. We won't be able to solve it entirely, certainly not during our lifetimes. We have to understand that some of these risks we're going to remain exposed to for the entirety of our lives, our children, our grandchildren. So we need to adapt. That means investing in infrastructure, but then of course, long term, we do want this problem to go away. So we also need to mitigate. How do we both adapt and mitigate? We want to get rid of COVID-19 ultimately. We want to decarbonize ultimately. So we need to work on that two-pronged approach where we adapt and we also mitigate. And then lastly, and it's why the Climate Solutions Caucus in the House is so important, and why the new Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in the Senate is so important. And kudos to Chris Coons and Mike Braun for coming together to form that caucus. For a long time, we try to encourage senators to start their own bipartisan caucus, and they wouldn't. Now they have. Momentum's on our side. Things are moving in the right direction. We just need to accelerate them. But we need a sincere, open-minded negotiation, and both sides need to understand that it isn't only their solutions that are going to rule the day. Innovation is important. A lot of Republicans are talking about that. We should invest as much as we can in new technologies, in carbon capture, in direct air capture, technologies that could really help us make a giant leap forward when it comes to decarbonization. But we also need to understand that there is already a cost to carbon pollution, and that cost needs to be accounted for in the economy. And that doesn't mean we need higher taxes, but we may certainly need new taxes, and we may need to swap out old taxes for new taxes that help us understand the cost of climate change and represent it transparently in the economy, and then allow Americans to make the best decisions for themselves and for their families. We need that accurate assessment of risk. We need those realistic solutions, but ultimately, we need people of goodwill to sit around the table the way we're all doing virtually today and have a negotiation, have a dialogue that helps us arrive at a compromise that leaves us all better off than we are today. So again, I want to thank you for this opportunity. The truth is, it isn't too soon to learn from the COVID-19 crisis and all the pain and death it has inflicted, not just in our communities here in the United States, but all over the world. And the only thing that I think could have a comparable effect is an unmitigated, unaddressed climate crisis. So that's why everyone's participation here is so critical. Again, thank you to the Wilson Center, to all the wonderful sponsors. I look forward to listening to the panel and learning, and continue walking along this path with all of you.
Congressman, thank you very much for those I'll call them foundational remarks, because so many of the issues that you raised will be very much front and center in this discussion going forward. And I think you've already in a number of these themes that we might want to mind. Let me ask you just one follow-up question, and then we'll go to the panel. And that is, you know, we are reactionary as a species. Oftentimes there's just way too much happening for us to think over the horizon about new threats and new issues. And certainly as we're dealing as a country and as a world in pandemics and other large issues for us facing us, what's your sense of Congress's, not appetite, but just in this current situation, the ability for them to move forward any recommendations that might come from a well-meaning, focused sense of urgency with those different caucus bodies? You know, there's so much happening. You have raised all sorts of red flags. You live in a state that is threatened. So what's your sense about how we could best help, A, move forward, and these discussions certainly help, but B, what's your sense internally about Congress's sheer ability to deal with this when many people are just worried about a paycheck right now, or even in 10 years from now?
So look, most people these days are pessimistic about politics. Our politics are toxic, they are disappointing, and I think that description is generous. I wouldn't be very hopeful about the rest of this year when it comes to Congress. We are in the midst of an unimaginable crisis right now. We are also in the midst of a presidential election and, of course, elections for U.S. House of Representatives and United States Senate. So it's going to be very difficult to get any meaningful policy enacted by the end of the year when it comes to climate risk and climate policy. But I'm extremely hopeful for the 117th Congress, which starts in January of next year, regardless of what happens with the presidential election. The change in Congress, the evolution over the last 18 months has just been remarkable. I left the Congress in January of 2019, where Republican leaders would not even acknowledge climate change. Today, you have leaders like Kevin McCarthy, who leads House Republicans, and Mike Braun, a Coal State senator, saying that they are the ones who are going to advance the solutions to solve climate change. Now, we should be skeptical. We should certainly wait and see. But that change that happened so quickly is evidence of significant momentum. And I can tell you, I speak to Republicans and Democrats in Congress frequently, and they are bullish as well. They understand that most members now in both parties are learning their lessons from COVID-19, that they realize that this is an issue, both COVID-19 and climate change, that needs less politics and more solutions, more policy debates, not politicization and exploitation of the issue for political gain. So everyone except the President of the United States is moving in the right direction. What I tell people is we just need to accelerate that process. And ultimately, again, no matter what happens in the 2020 presidential election, the momentum in Congress is irreversible. We're spending record amounts on environmental programs in this country, even under the Trump administration. The Defense Department is mitigating for climate risk under the Trump administration. So this trend is irreversible. That should make us optimistic, and it should motivate us to engage more and understand that if we're going to have a permanent or at least a durable solution to climate change, a true path to decarbonization, we better hope that the solution is bipartisan in nature. We don't want the solution for climate change to be like the solution for healthcare, where once the other party takes over, it just gets relentlessly attacked. That does not solve our problem. So despite what we see on the surface, which is a lot of negativity in our politics, a lack of solutions, there are many members of Congress working across the aisle who understand that this is solved, and we should do everything meant to contribute to that wonderful development inside the Congress.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate you allowing me to insert a question in there. And thanks for the response. Again, I think perfect target here for discussions to follow up from this panel. So thank you very much, Alice. Let me then go to you, because my stream of thought here brings me to the following. Let me ask you the question: how does climate change then make it difficult for U.S. national security interests to both prepare and then build a resilient infrastructure? And by national security, I mean, writ large national security in the broadest context.
Well, thank you, Mike, for having me. I'm delighted to join the Congressman and Chris Field and Les Williams to talk about this incredibly important issue. You asked a very important question, and your assumption is one that I think we need to just make clear, because when I speak to people about climate change and national security, including with members of the military, there is some confusion. I recall a policy friend of mine who described what one soldier asked her after she had discussed the ramifications of climate change for national security. He said, "I get what you're saying, ma'am, but in the military, I need to know what I need to shoot and what hill do I need to take?" And for that question, climate change does not really provide answers. Scholars, researchers are still looking at the connections between conflict and climate change. But what we do know at the core of national security is that climate change will affect military readiness. In fact, it already has. If we just look at a 3-year period, we saw massive damage to military installations in the United States. The Missouri River breached its levees in 2019, washing over a third of Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. A year earlier, Hurricane Michael swept over Tyndall Air Force Base on the panhandle of Florida. And that same year, Hurricane Florence just pummeled the Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. The total invoice to the military was about $10 billion. And of course, the military, like the US government, just self-insures. They don't have an insurance company they go make a claim against. It comes out of their own funds. But it's importantly not just the military bases themselves that are being affected, it's the communities that surround them. And it's also many other communities that aren't around military bases that are taking some very substantial hits from extreme weather, sea level rise, droughts, extreme heat, flooding. And from a military perspective, they need to now look outside the gates to make sure that those communities are resilient to be able to support our military operations. And then, of course, just training and acquisition of weapons, we need to look at that from a climate risk perspective. It's sometimes just too hot for these very healthy young men and women to train outside. But as you say, if you expand that aperture to include really human security, there are grave threats both in the United States as well as internationally. Livelihoods, as the congressman has said, will be greatly affected. About 1 billion people depend on fisheries across the world. We know that those fish are moving north in the face of acidification and warmer waters. We also are seeing extreme events regarding agriculture. If you just look at India this year, it's been hit by 2 typhoons, one on its east coast and one on its west coast, extremes of heat, and then locusts, as we've seen in Africa as well, that can consume a field in very short order. So we don't really understand yet what these risks are, as the congressman says, not only here nationwide. So we don't understand the public health threats, the threats to our already aging infrastructure fully. And importantly, we have no requirements yet to cause us to make sure that new investments are resilient in the future. And a similar picture is met overseas. There are, USAID has done some work in making sure its work is climate resilient, but we have many places in the world that we still need to focus on and make sure that they can remain safe and can continue to feed people, maintain access to fresh water. Once human security is degraded, it puts people on the move. Most will be displaced within their country, but that can be very aggravating to communities that are the receiving communities when they don't have adequate infrastructure or the policies in place to accommodate the new migrants. We know if we focused on resilience, we would save ourselves a lot of time, effort, and lives. For every dollar we spend on mitigating risk, we save $6 in the end. So to answer your question, it's a huge risk to all of us. Each of us, as the congressman said, here in the United States and worldwide, to the over 7 billion people in the globe. Virtually no one will be untouched by climate change. Very similar to COVID, except with COVID, I hope there's a vaccine. With climate change, we are looking for continuing change for this foreseeable future based on past emissions. So it's time for us to get very busy on making sure that we have a better result going forward.
Thank you, Alice. That was a wonderful response to it. I really appreciate that. Let me follow one theme there and ask Chris the following maybe 2-part question as a follow-up to Alice's response. And that is on the issue of risk perception. So Chris, can you address the importance of risk perception and how to effectively manage that perception in the midst of everything else we're experiencing, which is the changing nature of risk, the issue of risk in our country? That would be part A. And then if you can, part B would be, can you talk a bit about how climate change is impacting our notions of risk? If 30 years ago you mentioned risk to somebody, they would have maybe one list. And now if you mention risk, maybe that list has changed a bit and permeated our society. Can you take both of those on?
Well, thank you, Mike, for the questions, and to the Wilson Center for organizing today's event. And it's a pleasure to be joined to join Les and Alice and Congressman Cabello for this. You know, It is striking how our experience with COVID-19 really underscores the issues that come up in the context of a changing climate. We've seen dramatic examples of the consequences of under preparation and the kinds of financial returns on investment in preparation that Alice just talked about certainly play out. What we've really seen with COVID-19 so strikingly is how early action makes a big difference. And was just looking yesterday at the contrast between the implications of the virus in the US, where we've now had over 120,000 deaths, and in Taiwan, which is less than 100 miles from China, but where they've had a total of 5 deaths. And early action, decisive action, paying attention to the science on the best approaches to get ahead of the curve really make a difference. And those really play out in orders of magnitude with the climate challenge, which impacts so many aspects of the way that we need to proceed. The real challenge we face with climate is that it has the reputation of being a slow-moving, difficult to detect set of phenomena. But I think recent experiences have really changed the landscape so that instead of thinking about climate change as a distant kind of statistical element of our lives, we now are seeing real impacts of climate change. It's affecting real people with the kinds of economic damages that Alice already spoke about to military installations. It's impacting lives. It's impacting livelihoods now. And one of the things we need to transition to is framing in conversation, in action, in investments that recognizes that climate change is here now, and that this isn't about making preparations for some distant over the horizon set of issues, but it's for dealing with the issues that are present in the near term, that are immediate, and that respond to the kinds of investments in preparation that really make a difference. How do people think about climate change risk? I think there's a tremendous amount of leverage of the way it's presented in public discourse. And, when the federal government is downplaying the risks or making people question the science, it does make it really hard to align the resources in the kinds of smart ways that Congressman Cabello spoke about. And I think that the growing imperative in Congress to deal with the issue, the growing recognition among companies, cities, states, not-for-profit institutions, all point in the direction of aligning the forces to help people realize that risk from climate change is something that presents serious challenges, but also presents real opportunities. And I think it's important when we frame the risk issue going forward, that we frame it in terms of not only the way that investments can decrease the risks of bad things happening, but that smart investments can make lives better in the short term. And especially when we talk about building resilience, I think we're talking about building vibrant economies today and safe economies for tomorrow.
Thanks, Chris, for taking on that long question with a great answer. I really appreciate that. I want to do 2 things. I want to remind everyone participating that they are encouraged to ask questions of this panel or the congressman, and you can do that via email if you go to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. You can ask questions. Through that, it will be forwarded to me, and then I will ask specific to a panel member or in general. Les, since Chris just evoked the words economic, investments,
Sounds like I just got a curveball, Mike. I think you might have cut off, but that allows me to freestyle a little bit while you get your mic back on. So good to be here. Mike, thanks for having me. Alice and Chris, good to see you guys again. And Congressman Cabello, it's great to meet you. So, Mike, you were along those lines of the economic development and investments and how things impact all of society. What's really interesting, there's actually been 3 pandemics that have occurred since January 1st of this year. COVID-19, that was a big trigger event in terms of pandemic risks and communicable disease. The second risk has actually been going on for over 400 years, and we all know that risk to be the risk that Black Americans have been facing in this country. George Floyd was really the tipping point of that event. And the third risk, climate change. We've had so many events that have gone on, so many trigger points that, and Congressman Cabello hit the nail on the head, and Alice did as well, that there's been so many that I think society, this country, has kind of forgotten in terms of how important climate change is. When there's a 1,000-year flood that's happening 3 times within a 2-year period, that event needs to trigger something guttural within all of Americans as we approach this. What's really interesting in terms of the economic impact that climate change has had, especially around these other 2 risks that we addressed, the risk of facing Black Americans, and I'm 5 blocks away from the White House, so every time I leave my office, I see the military barricades that are set up and folks on their way to the protests, many of whom are white Americans, which is really amazing to see. And really, this George Floyd, again, was a tipping point in this. But when I'm on the metro, the majority of people I see are Black Americans. The vast majority of folks that are in these service industries, nurses, et cetera, are Black Americans or communities of color. So many times, working from home is not possible for many Black Americans. So we are exposed more to the virus. And that's why you've seen some of these numbers increase, and they're more than other races in different parts of the United States. But many times, if we look at 2005 Hurricane Katrina, if we look at the lower Ninth Ward, the vast majority of citizens who lived there were Black Americans. And this is repeated throughout the United States in issues, whether it be floodplains or places that are near hazardous waste sites, for example. Climate change impacts Black Americans disproportionately. So during this time, from an economic standpoint, when we need all of these critical workers to, care for our sick citizens in hospitals, nursing homes, et cetera, it's really important to have communities that are first responders, many of whom are, again, African Americans and nurses. It's important for them to be able to remain healthy and get to where they need to be, because they are an important part of this chain of resilient society members that we rely upon. So the dichotomy of the COVID-19 and climate change and the impact on Black Americans, it's been amazing that these 3 pandemics, and interesting how it's come to a head, which is just fascinating. And there'll be so many more books written about this in the future.
Thank you, Les. And hi, I'm Lauren Reese with the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. Mike is moderating this discussion from Alaska, which needs some infrastructure support, as we can see. And so his call dropped off. So hopefully he'll be joining us back again in a minute. But I'm going to step in the meantime. And thank you all very much for your really clear and substantive responses to Mike's questions. Alice, I think, Les made a really good point about what kinds of resilience need to be built, and resilience for whom and by whom. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, from your experience at the White House and since, who you see missing from the table. So who needs to be at the table in terms of making decisions for how to build U.S. Resilience for U.S. national security, but more broadly, human security in the U.S., who you see being left out that needs to be included in these critical conversations.
Well, thanks, Lauren. And you've pointed out a very important challenge for us here. When we look and think about resilience, it really has to be all of community and all hazard, because we can't just pick out a climate hazard and say we'll be ready for that, but not be ready for a pandemic and not be ready for whatever may come our way that we haven't thought of. So that is the focus in emergency management. But one of the things we don't do often is include all of the community. And typically who's left out are the most vulnerable, the people who have less voice in our communities. And so we need to think about ways we can structure meaningful dialogue that has everyone invested in the plan. There's one particular area where this has appeared to happen successfully. And we see some areas in big cities, but those are typically better funded. But this is for the state of Louisiana. They received some money from HUD as well as Rebuild by Design. The state had come up with a coastal plan that was to last for 50 years, and it did acknowledge sea level rise and the loss of land mass. But through a program called LA Safe, they went out to over 71 communities, talked to, in 6 parishes, talked about the very real risks the community would be facing and what are the resilient solutions for them. Interestingly, one of the most important that came out of that was mental health. Not many were important, but it was striking that people were recognizing that there's so much loss involved, as there is with the pandemic, as there is for other catastrophic risks, that we need to pay attention to this. That costs money. I think that was tens of millions to put on that effort, but it's critical that it's everyone's at the table and that we're considering everyone's needs. We also need to make sure we have a number of communities, often communities of color, that are basically trapped. They've been given poor lands or ended up in poor lands either by zoning or other means, and those lands are very vulnerable often to flooding or other challenges. So we need to think through how are we going to help those communities be able to particularly resolve the even more acute challenges they face, including, I just read today, access to fresh water. We have a number of communities where it will be simply too expensive. That costs more than 4% of household income to get fresh water. Well, that's going to fall on many people of color and impoverished people, and we need to address that. That will get worse with climate change. Those are the types of risks we need to bring in everyone and talk about how we're going to have fair results and make sure everyone is rising up with this. We're not leaving people alone, trapped, and really to a worse fate.
Thank you, Alice. Chris, I wonder if you could jump in and from your research and your experience in Northern California, talk a little bit about where you've seen effective responses to some of the climate change related crises in that region, or even if they haven't been effective, where you see glimmers of hope moving forward.
Thank you, Lauren. And let me start by amplifying a really important core theme that both Les and Alice have spoken to, and it's that so many of the impacts of climate change, like the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable folks in our society and on people who have been the subject of systemic racism. And so when we look at the kinds of risks that we face in California, with even, for example, wildfire, what we see is that the devastating wildfires in recent years have disproportionately affected 2 groups of people. People who were forced out of the major urban centers by the high cost of housing, and people who live in many cases hundreds of miles from the fire, but where the smoke exposure was amplifying other air pollution. This has been especially the case in the Central Valley. And one of the challenges that I think is most difficult moving forward is figuring out how to effectively integrate bottom-up community planning that's often so critical for success with effective incorporation of expert scientific knowledge about what the risks are and how they're distributed. The Louisiana program that Alice spoke about is one nice example of recognizing the need for this two-way conversation between local communities and technical experts. And we've seen other examples in California and around the world, but I would say that's the real frontier, is figuring out how to make these conversations effective so that we can take advantage of the best of what the technical experts have to offer. At the same time, we recognize that nobody understands the local issues, like the people who live there, and not only the representatives of the community, but representatives of the most vulnerable parts of those communities. Until we get that conversation right, we're going to be spending a lot of time spinning our wheels and addressing the margins of the issues rather than the cores.
Thank you so much. I think Mike has dialed in, so I'm going to give him an opportunity to say hello and see if it's connected properly.
Yeah, my apologies to everyone. Our power was out again for the 5th time this morning, so I apologize for that. But I do not want to disrupt the flow of this discussion since I've missed so much of it. But Lauren, can you hear me?
Yep. No, you're loud and clear. So I think you can probably pick it back up if you'd like. We also have some questions coming in over email. I think, Mike, what would you like to do?
Why don't you ask the first question that you have, and then you can send them to me and we'll pick up the conversation from there.
Great. Okay. So the first question that came in a little while ago is, what areas of research are most critical to helping address climate change from a national security standpoint? In particular, what role should the Department of Defense play in making those research investments? And I think that Alice, maybe you can take the first hit at that one.
Sure, that's a very important question. I think that you are seeing right now huge interest internationally on the issue of climate and international security. Next month, Germany will take over its 2-year co-leadership of the UN Security Council. They are not a permanent member, but they're co-leading with France. And climate security is one of the issues they're taking on. In fact, this morning, the Berlin Foreign Office sponsored a program solely on climate and international security, looking at the variety of threats. One of the areas of research that is the most difficult to understand is the interplay between climate change and conflict. We know that climate change is a threat multiplier, but we really don't understand yet fully how it affects conflict. We are seeing disturbing trends. There is more prediction that there may be more conflict than there's been historically. We have not had water wars. But with climate change, it's often a question of too much water or too little water. And when we have too little water, we will have some real conflicts developing over who has access to that fresh water. We also need to really study what's going to happen to the swath of the earth where in certain places in Africa, South America, sometimes it will be uninhabitable. It will simply, the temperatures will get too high for not only agriculture, but human life. The wet bulb temperature where it's unsafe to be outdoors for more than 6 hours before humans will die. Those are very important questions about where the people will go. And then also the room for insurgents to take advantage. We're seeing that with COVID, that we're seeing the Taliban coming to the rescue to say that they can help. We saw Chapo boxes in Mexico. El Chapo's daughters were providing services to the Mexican population during COVID. And we've also seen in Italy the mafia. So there's opportunities when governments are not strong to these extreme events for insurgents, terrorists, others, criminal elements to take advantage of that and not only recruit, but also expand their area of influence. All of that needs to be looked at. And then the really big question is, there's a fear that we are behind in our analysis and we're not matching our understanding is not actually matching what's happening in the atmosphere. And that there is really a great risk for some kind of abrupt change or some kind of change that we haven't really understood as the cascading impacts. And the sense is that we need to get a better handle on that as we go forward in order to make sure that we can properly signal how critical it is for everyone to focus on this catastrophic risk that is worsening and will continue to worsen for the foreseeable future, even if we get our emissions to zero. So there's a huge research agenda, and I hope that those of you on the audience who are interested in this get involved, because that's really talking about how does the planet go on to survive to ensure human security, but also the health of our planet so it can sustain human life animal life and our ecosystems. So lots to learn.
Alice, this is Mike. Thank you very much for that. I wonder if I can impose on Les maybe to jump in on that from your perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alice, you hit the nail on the head. Specifically, when that question was asked, and as you were talking, Alice, what sprang to mind for me was DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the arm of the U.S. Department of Defense that really is responsible for the emerging technologies. Right now, Mike, where you're located, you're a lot closer to the Arctic Circle than all of us are right now. But if you talk about the number of, how much ice is melting in that area, and there's new trade routes that are being opened up. And so there's been conflicts, different submarine fleets from Russia, the United States, and other nations that are trying to map out these new routes. And so DARPA is also an amazing arm to jump in, and they have invested some money in researching of climate change because, whoever gains hold of the Arctic Circle and other areas like that were previously unexplored really has a competitive advantage, and not just from a military perspective, but also from a trade perspective, trade routes, and also natural resources. So DARPA is it hits so close to home just because of the work that they do.
Yeah, great points, Les. Thank you. And I want to thank folks for sending in really wonderful questions. Here's a question, but let me just work through a number of them. First, let me go back to Chris. Chris, do you have a follow-up for that?
On the research priorities, I think that both Les and Alice pointed to really important things. My sense, having spent decades working on the natural science components of climate change, is that the really big uncertainties are in two key areas. One is in the way different parts of the system interact. Alice pointed to climate and conflict or climate and water availability. I think what we're seeing now is that when things break is when multiple parts of the climate system are interacting in unexpected ways. Sea level rise interacting with a severe storm, or a heat wave interacting with a failure in the electricity grid, things that make a difficult but managing situation go to one that's catastrophic. Or the other area that we don't know as much about as we should is the way that the initial impact in, say, for example, heavy precipitation ramifies through the social, political, and economic systems. And I think that from the perspective of the climate scientists, we've been taking too narrow a view of what the climate problem is. The climate problem certainly has these important physical drivers, but it has really critical economic amplifiers. It has public health components. It has racial inequality components. And until we broaden out the research lens to be looking at all of those things simultaneously, it's going to be really hard to understand the dimensions of the problem, and I would argue essentially impossible to come up with compelling approaches to solutions.
Well, Chris, thank you for that, because that just opened up not a rabbit trail, but a different path. So I'm going to hold on several of these questions for a moment and follow this particular thread. To all three of you. Chris, we'll start with you. Related to the research community, many of us have been related to it. We'd like to do our research. We are particularly focused in our disciplines, and we follow the themes and the great questions of our disciplines. But perhaps without putting words in your mouth, what you are saying here is that's a very good and noble cause. But to use Alice's note, widen the aperture, where in fact, yes, research is this iterative organic process, but also there might be some drivers as to what the needs are. So two things. One is from the research community, yes, we want them to do their research, and that is, full of innovation and disciplinary challenges, but in fact, to at least take some advanced steps to address climate globally, there needs to be some drivers that also focus the research community or focus the research questions in a way that perhaps isn't all organic, but simply is generated by need. So I don't mean to put words in your mouth, A, is what I've just said close to the truth? And B, what do you recommend, having been a member of IPCC, what do you recommend in terms of focusing perhaps the research a little bit more so that we can, maybe leverage the assets and the expertise a little bit better?
That's a great question. And I think Les and Alice have already spoken to key aspects. And I'll just raise two components that I see as really central. The first is that when we conceive of research, we need to have a broader lens for what it means to tackle all the dimensions of the problem. The issue that Alice raised about the intersection between mental health and climate change, a really key one. We should be thinking about designing research projects that have an explicit focus on mental health. At the same time, they have a focus on the heat wave and the heavy precipitation and the sea level rise. The second is that we really need to think much harder about the way that bottom-up community perspectives get incorporated in the research. I would say that the traditional vision of the way climate change research works is that the experts come up with a hypothesis, write a technical paper, deliver that to a community. And we need to move towards something that looks much more like co-design, where before the research question is even articulated, there's a process where communities and researchers come together and figure out what are the issues that need to be addressed. I feel like way too often with climate change and with use-inspired research in general, we in the technical community provide solutions to the wrong problem, and getting the problem right is gotta be a key change in the future. And that can only come from a much more intentional conversation between the people who need to develop the solutions and the people who need to live with them.
Thank you. Alice, Les, I can't see you, but is there any follow-up to that? If not, I want to go on to another question or two.
Well, I'll just add something that's interesting in this regard to me. Right now with adaptation, we are pretty much letting communities figure it out on their own. So California is taking a leadership role, New York and New York City are taking leadership roles, as is actually Florida and Miami to a large extent. But we have many communities that simply don't have access to the necessary resources to understand their vulnerabilities or even to know what questions they need to ask. But if that reflects our federal system, a lot of choices, and we just haven't really invested deeply in helping these communities be able to understand risks so that they can thrive. But if you compare that to China, which started this sponge city, an authoritarian regime, but they started a sponge city initiative where they started with piloted with a few cities, and then it's expanded to, last time I checked, over 30 cities. Told each of those cities that they needed to cut their stormwater drainage by 70%, so to deal with extreme precipitation events, and there'd be no extra money for it. But that was the order. So I'm not in favor of authoritarian regimes, but I do understand that China will now have a whole library of practices, ideas, and other things to share about how best to deal with too much rain. And we need to have that kind of library or system available to all the communities across the United States so that they can learn from each other instead of having to reinvent the wheel. That is a critical need at this point because otherwise they're just left to their own devices in terms of really finding the information, the financing, and other things. And for an already cash-strapped community, one that's suffering from COVID, that's a very tall order at the moment.
Thank you, Alice. Les, I have a question for you, and then I want to open it up to Chris and Alice as well. Here's the question. Individuals and communities will bear the brunt of coming life disruptions due to climate change. How can the energy skills of local individuals and organizations be encouraged and supported to proactively be involved in building solutions and addressing anticipated problems and risks.
Yeah, that covers a lot. I love it. That's a good example is actually in California, Chris's state, where he's at right now. Last year, an Assembly bill was passed, Assembly Bill 1054, and I had a chance to talk with Alice and Chris about this in California last fall. To me, this is such an important model for other types of risks, even beyond wildfire risks. So what this Assembly Bill 1054 entails is an investor-owned utility, right? If you want access to a pool of money set aside to cover some of the liabilities that occur based on damages that your equipment causes, for example, down power lines, then in order to dip into this pool, and the fund is about $10.5 billion, you have to put proactive measures in place, i.e. tree trimming projects around sensitive power lines. That's how some of these wildfires have started in the past. Shut-off switches that are up to date and modern, many across the state of California and the United States for that matter, are outdated, right? So it's a $10.5 billion pool. Businesses and residences are going to cover half of that $10.5 billion via a surcharge they're already paying in their bills, $2.50 every month, right? The other half are the investor-owned utilities. So what's interesting, this is not a replacement for insurance, right? Because if a company is going to get sued, for example, directors and officers insurance, right? It's not going to cover things like that. But what it will do, it'll ease some of the pressure off of the insurance market that pays for these liabilities that take place. More are going to happen. We all know, not just in the state of California, but in different parts of the United States. So it's a buy-in with communities in the form of businesses and homes, as well as utilities, publicly owned utilities. It's so powerful because I view this as other companies and utilities across the United States adopting this, not just in the sector of wildfires, but also or wildfires/utilities, but also dams. Over half of the dams, I think 54% of the dams, according to FEMA, are privately owned. Many are in disrepair, as we have seen from past dams that have cracked, broken. Oroville was a most recent example of a major dam. So if we can invest money, similar to what we did with California AB 1054, where you have the local communities where these dams are, as well as the owners of the private dams, right? In order to get access to these funds, should your dam break and cause significant damage due to climate change, because we know that storms are becoming more harsh, more severe, and more frequent, then the insurance industry that's paying for some of the cleanup won't have to bear such a burden in this. But in order to access these funds, you, Mr. or Mrs. Owner of the dam, need to make certain upgrades. So in my mind, it's like a resilience bond. We all know the typical model of a CAT bond, catastrophe bonds that are taking place, right? Totally separate from an insurance company, right? It's over here on the side. If an event happens, i.e. storm surge hits, 3 feet above the level that it was supposed to hit, then the catastrophe bond will pay out for a city. Resilience bond, and the first one was done by EBDR. It's a European bank. It's done recently, actually September of 2019, $700 million resilience bond. What it says is, if you're a city, a town, or state government, and you purchase a multi-year catastrophe bond, let's call it 3 to 5 years, if you're going to put processes in place that will reduce the risk of, let's say, of flood from occurring, meaning in the form of a stronger levee system or a taller levee, right, or installing mangroves that are going to make sure that flooding doesn't take place along a certain riverbank, for example, then we're going to cut your insurance premium down by a certain amount. And over that 3 to 5 year period, the money that you would have paid us, the insurance company, you can now invest in infrastructure. So I think we're going to see a lot more resilience bonds that are taking place. Alice and Chris probably know the gentleman, but the head of the chief resilience officer for the city of Boulder has been experimenting with this as well. So what I see, Mike, going forward in this, because we're all interconnected, like I started off, we're a resilient chain that's interconnected, right? All of us are. The homes, businesses, and the utility companies / the insurers, right? We have to find a way to offload some of these insurance claim payouts into another vehicle that also encourages resilience.
One of the things love about that question is it really digs into this issue of, well, is this a responsibility of individuals, of communities, of companies, or of national scale governments? And I think we often get tangled up in trying to figure out which one of the entities is key, when it really has to be a partnership involving all those different levels. With wildfires, we know that there's steps that individual homeowners can take that dramatically decrease their risk, preparing defensible space, keeping the leaves and branches off your roof. But at the same time, having thoughtful policies implemented at the state and federal level about reducing fuels and ensuring emergency evacuation plans are in place, that with essentially every one of these adaptation risks we look at, we can identify a key role for actors, individual companies, communities, federal government, and it doesn't work unless they all play a role.
Thanks, Chris. Alice, any further comments on that issue before I move on to another question?
No, I think they covered it really well. Very exciting
Yeah.
ideas and important concepts here.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Speaking of supply chain, a question from Paula Brooks, who served on President Obama's state, local, and tribal leaders task force on climate preparedness and resilience. Boiling down her question, this is it. She would like for us to address some issues of food security and the supply chain. On food security, that should concern us all, especially given the COVID-19 supply chain issues. So ways in which, we will need to address the impacts of climate. And I think her question is food security writ large, everything from actual access to the full supply chain. So who would like to take the first swing at that one? That's a big question.
I can start. I think it's a very important question because certainly we have our bread baskets are concentrated. And if we have trouble there could be trouble spreading across the world. And that we know if food prices are volatile, that can be very unsettling for communities and can really be very destabilizing. A couple of the things that are emerging in the face of increased climate risk are cooperatives sponsored by the World Food Program, the UN, and others to try to come up with regional food stocks. So there's stockpiling of food in Asia and now in Africa to make sure that very basic supplies are available. Historically, countries have gone back and forth between having stockpiling their own food supplies for a while. Certainly as we were moving to these very global supply chains, first in time, very effective, efficient, and cheap, there was a move away from that because of the concerns about effect on prices and the markets. But recently, as COVID-19 has revealed, our supply chains are not sufficiently redundant to protect us from major disruptions. If it occurs in one place, right now it's occurring in many places because of COVID-19, but we also see it occurred in Thailand in 2011 with flooding in Australia. Flooding interrupted the supply of coal. That was for climate folks, that might have not been so bad, but it just illustrates a disruption. And we will see more and more of those going forward with more extreme events. So we need to have redundancy, and we need to think through how we will smooth out the bumps in the supply chain for food. And I think that's going to require greater regional coordination to ensure that those food is available on a scale that will require distribution systems and other things. But initially, we have to identify how we're going to have food quickly available when fields are destroyed by salt water, when we have fires and flooding that just destroys agriculture or livestock.
Yeah, and from an insurance perspective too, I see a big part of the solution in parametric insurance. By 2050, the 70%, our global intake of food is going to increase. The demand is going to increase by 70% from today's numbers. And already in Kenya, for example, acre and Fricka, Africa play on words there. That's the name of the company, really hard to say. What they've done is they're using parametric insurance to increase access to farmers in terms of drought insurance. So if insufficient rainfall occurs, measured via satellites and sensors, automatically money can be sent to farmers in Kenya. They don't have to wait weeks or months while their families starve. And, if we all know, it's all a linked chain, like Chris was saying earlier, all interconnected. It leads to increased poverty. Then all of a sudden, people who need that food that buy from the farmers, they themselves can't get access to the food, et cetera, et cetera. So really important. And blockchain, I think, is going to play a big part of this too. They do have technology in India as well, similar along the lines of in Kenya, where secure payments and transactions are being paid to Indian farmers. If there is a drought, parametric insurance, certain level of rainfall is not reached within a matter of weeks or a month or so, then you will automatically get paid out. So that's going to help in terms of keeping as many families and individuals above the poverty level as possible, because the payouts, as we saw from Hurricane Katrina, big problem was how can you get the funds in your pocket to recover quickly?
Thanks, Les. Chris, any comments on that?
I think those answers were great and comprehensive.
Great, thank you. Next question, perhaps fittingly so, since I'm without power at the moment. Is there any comprehensive effort to address the vulnerability, both to climate change impacts and to cybersecurity of the power grid in the United States?
There has been really a growing amount of attention focused on the vulnerability of the power grid to climate change. And one of the frustrating features of the way our power system works is that it was built on a number of decisions about the way electricity should be partitioned and how you could provide high reliability power in different parts of the country based on technology in the 19-teens and the 1920s. And one of the things we know now is that many of those decisions have resulted in heightening vulnerabilities rather than in controlling those. And I would say that the design thinking is actually ahead of the implementation and the way we manage the power companies, the way that investors are rewarded for investing in power, sort of even the definition of what a utility is in terms of being the power producer and the power distributor are going to need to be rethought if we're going to be able to take advantage of many of the features that sort of intrinsically come with the kind of distributed power generation that renewables provide. If we're looking at a portfolio that's got wind and solar and hydro and biomass and natural gas with carbon capture and storage, potentially we have a lot more sources that we can integrate into making a grid that's reliable, but we need to have economic integration that makes it possible for the power to flow from wherever it's generated to wherever it's needed, and that makes it possible for the providers of the emergency power to get compensated for providing that kind of backup services. And right now there are a whole bunch of issues of the way power is regulated and distributed that make that difficult.
One of the worries that I have regarding climate change and cyber, we do a lot of work in cybersecurity as well, cyber insurance, and the amount of dam control systems, power grid systems that are now run by technology, a woman or a man somewhere that's opening or closing a dam remotely, right? If nobody's working at a dam, he or she can do that remotely. IoT devices, they number in the billions globally, but that's really ripe for evil actors, whether it be state actors or whether it be somebody in their basement that's toying around and having fun. As we have more of these extreme weather events, it only takes one or two people to say, you know what, next time there's a major flood that's occurring or a rain bomb that's occurring, I'm going to, stop the controls of the dam in the Midwest somewhere just to see what happens. And we all know what can happen is major disaster that can take place for communities surrounding that area. So as we're more dependent on IoT devices that are controlling some of our systems like hydroelectric plants and beyond, and we have more people that are doing this, not only that state actors that don't like our country, but also people that are just having fun, right? And this is happening more and more, people doing things just for the thrill of it. That's what I worry, and that's why cybersecurity is really closely linked into climate change, specifically to things like our power grid and also for dam control systems, because more of these events are going to occur in the future, and we're going to be exposed if we don't have any sorts of cyber resiliency built in to our systems.
Thanks, Les. Alice, any comments on that?
Yes, I would just add that to my knowledge, there is no comprehensive scheme to ensure resilience of our power grids. We've had some interesting developments after events. After Sandy, we saw Con Edison wanted a rate increase, and some creative lawyers, Michael Gerard out of Columbia, intervened in that rate increase to say, if you want rate increases, you're going to have to you should build resilience. And we've certainly seen in California now with the challenges there, more pressure to have resilience. But there isn't a greater plan. A lot of this is regulated through state public utility commissions and other means, and we need some kind of overall assurance as to our grid security, to cyber, and to climate impacts, but we don't have it yet.
Yeah, thank you. It actually just dovetails back that question. All three of your answers dovetail back to Congressman Cabello's note during his keynote. The three themes that I took away from it: we need a true and accurate risk assessment, and hopefully from that comes a plan. But that links to both Senate and House climate caucuses being able to help that, enable that kind of work being done, and then subsequent plans to adapt and mitigate. That just echoes to move it forward. Alice, while I have your attention, the next question here is, how can we better anticipate and prepare for environmental and climate-induced migrants?
That is a important question. And we're not making a great deal of progress in terms of global agreements on what to do. There have been some initial attempts to get to international agreement, but they're not binding. And then within the United States, of course, we're going to see a lot of displacement as seas rise, as areas become less desirable because they're so hot, or certainly in certain areas that are subject to flooding or wildfire, we will see people exit. What's critical with this is that we focus on the receiver communities. If you think about Paradise Fire, we saw deaths there, and we saw a community basically wiped out within a matter of hours. I think it was about, I can't recall the exact numbers, but about 20,000 people land on the city of Chico, and the city of Chico already had a shortage of affordable housing. Suddenly their schools are full, suddenly the roads are crowded. We need to think through, what kind of support do we give to communities that will likely receive migrants, to support those communities to be able to integrate people and make sure it's a smooth transition. Of course, we'll have two types of migrants: some that are abruptly displaced because of a flood or a wildfire, and then some who just slowly move away as the seas rise, or and their homes become soggy, or they don't like the types of temperatures they're experiencing in their community. All of these need to be addressed, and we really need to think about some kind of department or entity that's just thinking through, how do we help the people that are on the move, the receiving communities, and then of course the communities that lose populations will have significant impacts to their tax base as a result of that, and how do we smooth out events for them as well. Really challenging, and there isn't, as far as I know, true serious work going on in the United States to answer these questions yet, in terms of policies.
Thank you. Anyone else want to address that one?
You know, this issue of climate-induced migration, incredibly important, but like almost all the other adaptation challenges that we've been discussing here, the key determinant of whether it's going to be manageable or not manageable depends on our success with mitigating climate change and keeping the total amount of change toward the low end of the possible range. If we can limit warming to 2°C or less above pre-industrial, we can effectively figure out ways to manage displacement, to manage rising sea levels, to manage the increase in heat waves. If we're looking at an end of century conditions where the warming is twice that much and increasing by 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade, all bets are off the table. We really haven't come up with anything even approaching a vision of being able to manage under those conditions of severe climate change. And so at the same time, we're talking about the tremendous value and opportunities and investments in adaptation. We need to make sure that the mitigation challenge doesn't drift off of the center stage.
I just have to second that. If you work on climate change, adaptation, resilience, you quickly conclude we need to cut emissions now to have any kind of safe future. So thank you, Chris, for just reminding us how important, and that really is the biggest resilience strategy of all.
I think we got a little peek into what could be a future, unfortunately, during this crisis where we saw skies clear, carbon emissions reduced so much that skies cleared around the world, so much so that people were doing before and after photos. We call that a window into what could be. We have time for one more question and then some wrap-up comments from the panelists. We don't have a lot of time, but it's an important question. How do you address climate change in fragile countries or regions experiencing political instability? Do you address climate first or the instability?
Well, I'll take a shot at that right now. I think the answer to that question really isn't known yet, but there's certainly an understanding that we're going to have to address the underlying state of play in any country to have successful resilience strategies. So that is an added layer of stress for all, including those who are trying to deliver aid and be of assistance. But those countries, sadly, are also among those that will be most affected by climate change, the ones that are experiencing conflict now. So it's a very important issue that we need to research and understand better. From my perspective, I don't have the answer, maybe other researchers do, but it is key as to how we're going to help those countries have a better future when they're already suffering from conflict now. We know that climate change is a threat multiplier, and the fear is, of course, it will exacerbate pre-existing conflict as it worsens.
Yeah, well, along those lines too, Alice, you're right there. The answer to that is tough. The only thing that I can ponder is, earlier the example I gave with Acre Africa, and if we are helping farmers stay out of poverty, which is a kind of a unbroken link in the chain of resiliency, where that means more people will not resort to other means of illegal activities, i.e. the drug trade or, God forbid, robbing banks or stores to make a living for their families. If we can influence these nations that are involved in conflict, that there is an economic benefit to them and their people. A lot of them are elected politicians. In the case of authoritarian regimes, that's not the case. But if we can make governments look better by saying, hey, there's this really unique thing that we would like to present to you. It's technology using something called blockchain, where your farmers will be able to access the funds that you want to give them anyways during a drought. And if, from an economic term, if we can say we can help you save more money or make more money for your for the background of your economy, that's probably a good way to start. It's really tough, especially in areas of conflict, and there's so many, I can't even name them all. Many of them are in emerging market economies. But if you can find a way to make the government look good by supporting their people from a perspective like farming. That's the first thing that comes to mind. That may be a good start.
I think weak governments and corrupt institutions are a deep problem. They make any action on a critical issue, whether it's COVID-19 or climate change, much more difficult to address. But it is important to recognize that there are many layers at which solutions can come. Les already spoke to the power of the private sector. Alice spoke earlier to the role of entities like the Taliban in providing civil services under conditions where the federal government isn't equipped to do that. And with climate change, even in the context of weak institutions and corrupt governments, international organizations, community-based organizations can make contributions, and we want to recognize and celebrate those. At the same time, it needs to be really clear that unless governments are, effectively working for the good of their people, that all this stuff is going to proceed much more slowly and much less effectively than it could.
Thank you, Chris. I could do this for another hour, but unfortunately we only have another 4 minutes. This has been a wonderful discussion, great foundation laid by Congressman Cabello. I wonder if each of you would take perhaps a minute or so just to give us your final thoughts on any of the strings that we've talked about today, or any of the themes we've talked about today, or anything in particular you would like to highlight. Alice, maybe I could start with you.
Sure. Well, what gives me hope is that even in the midst of COVID, we have been able to continue to have discussions about the catastrophic risk of climate change. We've seen some nations actually tie the response to COVID to better action on climate, notably Germany and Canada. And we've also seen people getting out on the streets for Black Lives Matter, for climate. And I think that there's just a growing recognition that these fault lines, so an emerging one with climate change, a long-standing one with inequality and systemic racism, that we need to do better. And so it really causes me to be inspired when I see the millions of people across the globe crying out to say, we need to do better and we need to address the problems that we have and move forward. So that gives me hope. I think we can harness that. And in fact, we can do better, and there can be a better world ahead. So thanks so much for having me here today.
Yeah, Alice, great comments. Thank you very much. Les?
Yeah, along the same lines of Alice, I see hope too. In the examples she gave were prescient. So Rebecca Henderson, she's a famed economist and professor at Harvard Business School. She was interviewed recently by the dean of Harvard Business School, and she said, capitalism is arguably the greatest invention of the human race. Its ability to generate prosperity, innovation, growth, and individual freedom is completely unparalleled, and that we have no alternative but to pursue capitalism if we are to address the obstacles that we face. And what's interesting, if Alice was spot on, these three pandemics that I opened with, business has responded to those three pandemics. The first is the racism that has been going on for many years in this country. If you look at some examples I have here, the chief marketing officer of Bombas, the cool sock making company, Kate Hewitt, she was inspired by Jessica McGlory, her black colleague, and she rallied her white network to basically say, look, VCs and investors, we should be reaching out more to black entrepreneurs and black business people. So there's a Google document that's going all around the internet with 900 mostly white VCs and investors saying, I'm only allocating June and July, I'm only allocating meetings with black entrepreneurs. Alex Ohanian, he stepped down from the board of Reddit and said, I want a black person to take over my place. COVID-19 is the same thing, how businesses have stepped up. A prime example is all these companies, GM, Ford, Bauer, they make hockey equipment. They all reassembled their manufacturing lines and they're making face shields. Bauer even went a step further and said, we are giving the blueprints out to our competitors and to the auto companies to say, here's best practices of how we've learned how to design these face shields. Businesses, I believe it's the same way. They are going to be a big key to fighting climate change. I remember in the past, it was no longer cool for somebody to say the word Black Lives Matters if you work at a company. Now, every company is saying it. Climate change, the congressman started off the call by saying a lot of people didn't want to put the words climate and change together in one sentence. Now you're seeing more companies do that. The ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, they're leading a global push towards climate change via their climate coalition, where they're involving both governments and businesses at a regional level and a national level to combat this problem. So I am bullish on business, like Rebecca Henderson said earlier, to really lead the charge, working with governments and also individuals.
Thank you, Les. Chris, you have the final word.
Well, thank you, Mike, for a wonderful moderation. Thanks, Les and Alice. It's been a real privilege to share ideas here. And it is inspiring. It's inspiring to see millions of people peacefully in the street arguing for social and racial justice. It's been inspiring to see millions of young people in the streets arguing for climate justice. And there's no question that we're at a point where the society needs to inflect to new priorities and new investments. I think we've, in the conversation today, explored a whole bunch of mechanisms that are pushing us in the right direction. And I think that coalescence of the will to act and the capability to do it, it paints a promising picture for dealing with, I love the concept of the three pandemics that Les started it off with, the COVID-19, the climate change pandemic, and the pandemic of systemic racism. But they're ones that are going to require focused attention. They need to be the national and international and community level and business priority going forward. And taking the eye off the ball is going to be in many ways the greatest risk. We have at this point the desire to address them. I think we have the resources and the knowledge, and now we just need to follow up with the commitment to make good on the promise.
Great wrap there, Chris. Thank you so much for weaving an hour and a half all together. That was fantastic. My thanks to Alice, to Chris, to Les, Amanda King, and Lauren Nisi for putting this all together, and for the many people online who participated. We're sorry we did not get to all of your questions. I know that if you contacted each of these speakers, they'd be more than happy to get back in touch with you. And thanks again to Stanford and to Risk Cooperative and to Council on Foreign Relations for their support. And I look forward to following up this conversation with many others on this emerging topic. So thank you so much to everyone. I appreciate it, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.